Hello out there, this is Gerhard. I hope you've all made a smooth and healthy transition into the new year. And for the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to cover chapter 16 of Ebert and Griffin's Business Essentials book, which is the chapter that focuses on securities exchanges and in particular on stocks and bonds. Now, the central term in this chapter is the word security. And as you know, security has a bunch of different meanings in English, but in the context of this chapter, and more important, in the context of investing on a stock exchange, for example, a security is a very specific type of investment. Breaking it down into its elements, a security is any investment that is certified by a document. That means that is proven by a document, and that confers or gives certain financial claims to the owner. Now, theoretically, that means that that any investment where there is paper proof could be considered a security, but usually the term security is reserved for fairly large investments where the issuer has split up these investments or this investment into many smaller standardized portions that are then sold to different investors, usually but not always via a stock exchange. There's many different categories of securities, but the two that we'll look at in this chapter are actually the two most classic categories of securities, and they are first and foremost stocks or shares, and then bonds. If a company decides to issue stocks, then it does this because it wants to either increase its equity or sell its existing equity to new owners. So as you know, the German translation for equity is Eigenkapital. If a company wants to increase its equity, for example, then it could either do this by taking in a few new investors and selling the equity directly to them, or instead, the company might decide that it wants to split up the equity that it wants to raise into small portions, each of which is documented by a stock or share. So that means rather than finding one or two new investors to provide a total of 100,000 euro in equity, instead the company might split the 100,000 in equity into 1,000 shares and sell these to 100 different investors who would then become co-owners. There's a few advantages of that for a company. First of all, it's usually easier to find people willing to contribute 1,000 euro rather than one or two who would be willing to contribute 100,000 euro, for example. So it's usually easier to find investors if you're trying to raise a very large additional sum of equity. And on the other hand, since each of the investors only owns a small share of the company, they're all co-owners of the company, none of them usually has enormous influence on the decision-making power in the company. So those are two reasons why a company might prefer to issue shares rather than just finding direct investors. Now, the question arises as to what the advantages for the buyers of the shares are. And generally speaking, there's three traditional rights that a stockholder or shareholder has. First, and usually most important to the shareholder, he or she has the right to receive dividends. Now, dividends are a portion of the company's annual profits that are then distributed to the shareholders, usually as a percentage of the share value that the shareholder has. So that's the first right, the right to receive dividends. Secondly, a stockholder or shareholder also has the right to vote at the general meetings of a company. So when important decisions are made, the shareholder has a right to participate in this decision-making process. Finally, in case the company decides to close down or God forbid, in case it's liquidated because of bankruptcy proceedings, if there are any liquidated asset values left over after creditors are paid out, then these are distributed among the existing shareholders. So if a company closes down, a shareholder or stockholder also has the right to receive the liquidation proceeds once the creditors have been paid. Not all types of stock are identical in terms of their rights, though. Basically, the type of share that I just talked about is referred to as an ordinary stock or ordinary share. In contrast, though, there's also preferred stock or preferred shares, and preferred stock also confirms partial company ownership upon the owner, so it's the same as an ordinary share in that context. However, one of these three traditional rights of an ordinary share, namely dividends, voting rights, and rights to liquidated assets, is reduced in comparison to an ordinary share, while another is increased. For example, preferred shares very often offer a higher dividend or a dividend that's paid earlier than ordinary shares do, but simultaneously limit or even eliminate the shareholder's right to vote at a general meeting. This is the most common form of preferred share, but it's not the only type that exists. Basically, the appropriate definition is that one of these three rights is reduced in comparison to an ordinary share, while another of the rights is enhanced or increased in comparison to an ordinary share. The second classic category of security is a bond. And a bond originates whenever a company or government takes a loan by securitizing it. We're all familiar with bank loans, and companies regularly take out bank loans. However, if the amount in question, if the loan amount that the company needs is very high, then it might make more sense to split up this loan into small investment portions and sell it as a bond or as numerous bonds. The investors who buy these bonds become creditors of the company. And once again, this has certain advantages for a company in comparison with taking a bank loan from one or two financial institutions. First of all, if the required loan amount is very high, then it will very often be easier to find numerous small investors rather than finding a few very large investors to provide the amount. Secondly, the terms, the interest that a company has to pay on bonds can often be lower, cheaper, than if they were to take a bank loan from a few institutions. And finally, you've got to consider the control issue again. If a company has borrowed money from one, two, or even three financial institutions, then ultimately those banks have a very high degree of control over what the company can and cannot do. On the other hand, if a company has dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of creditors in form of bondholders, well, then it's much more difficult for them to coordinate any strategy of company control than it would be for a few smaller financial institutions. For these reasons, companies have certain advantages when they issue bonds. On the other hand, creditors or investors that buy these bonds also have various advantages. Please continue by watching the next video.